Hi, everyone. My name is Lee Janko. I'm a political theorist at the London School of Economics. I'm here to give you a lecture today on comparative political theory. I'll be introducing a bit about what this kind of thing is and why it should be meaningful for you. I'm going to try to share my screen with you now. I'm going to have a series of slides. So hopefully the slides will help you better understand what I'm about to say. You should still be able to see me in the top right corner. Okay, so comparative political theory is, I'm calling this lecture, I'm subtitling it The Challenge of Non-Western Thought, because basically comparative political theory has been developing over the past few decades in the discipline of political theory as a way of understanding and broadening the perspectives from which political theory draws. So for those of you that aren't familiar, political theory tends to be a pretty Eurocentric discipline, by which I mean the bulk of its texts, both canonical and contemporary, tend to be focused on not only on European and American thinkers, overwhelmingly white male European and American thinkers, but also focused on the concerns and dilemmas of the affluent liberal democracies that characterize much of the Western world. So I think in many ways, comparative political theory is trying to deparochialize political theory in the sense it's trying to take some of these issues away from the centrality of Euro-America and try to think about what a more global political theory might look like. So here's a plan of the lecture. I start with a short biography of me, not because I'm particularly important, but because it might help you understand where I'm coming from when I talk about comparative political theory and my opinions about it. I then go on to consider what comparative political theory might be, like what it actually is or what people say it is, and why we as political theorists and others might need it. We then go on to talk about the specific challenges faced by comparative political theory and its goal of deparochializing political theory. So it turns out that a proper deparochialization or a proper globalization of political theory is actually harder than you might think. It's not simply a matter of adding non-Western thinkers and giving it all a good stir. It actually has a lot to do with on what terms we include. Finally, I conclude the lecture by considering some additional questions raised about comparative political theory, or CPT, and what its benefits and limitations might be. So here's the short bio of me. I guess the important things to know about myself and how I come into comparative political theory is that I actually started off studying China and Chinese history, and then I studied political theory. So unlike many people who study political theory and then want to branch out into non-Western various forms of thought, global thought, I sort of did things the other way around. And I think that makes a difference for how I think about the problems and limitations of mainstream Euro-American political theory. So that's the first thing. The second thing to know about me and why I'm a little bit strange. I'm strange in many ways, but the particular way in which I'm strange from a comparative political theory perspective is that despite many people working in the field, I actually don't work directly on Confucianism. So my first two books were on the late Qing and early Republican period, 清末民初的那个时代. So I read a lot of journals, articles, sort of a lot of the literature produced by public intellectuals of the time. So something like Dongfang Zazi, you see that on the left side of the screen there, reading a lot of articles from that and trying to figure out how these people in the late 19th, early 20th century in China were thinking about the political issues, political problems, the dilemmas of political life. My newest project, I'm thinking, actually, I've taken it back to the Ming Dynasty, and I'm thinking a lot of Ming and early Qing dynasties, and I'm thinking a lot about how Ming thinkers and Qing thinkers identify and organize difference, human difference, different kinds of human nature. So that's my current project, and on the right you can see there it's an edict from, I believe this is from Yongzheng. So in other words, I don't study the typical texts of Confucianism, the Luyu, the monks. Those texts are hugely important and interesting, but that hasn't been the focus of my research. So I am a bit different in that sense. So this is my first book. I called it making the political after a phrasing that Zhang Shijiao himself used when talking about his own political goals and interests. And what I tried to do in this book, and this gives you some sense of where I'm going with comparative political theory, I tried to see Zhang Shijiao, who was a very prominent early 20th century thinker in China, studied in the UK for 4 years, went back, had lots of ideas about how to transform and reform the Chinese state and society. I tried to see him as introducing some novel questions into existing debates in political theory about the problems of founding. That is to say, how do you start a state or a community from nothing, right? Like what is the mechanism by which we as a community come together and constitute ourselves as a political society? He gave a lot of really interesting thought to these questions, and I tried to take them seriously, and I brought them to bear on debates in political theory by people like Hannah Arendt, Hannah Pitkin, Bonnie Honig. My second book, which I called Changing Reference, I say here that it's method-based political theory. What I was trying to do here is think about the ways in which late Qing and early Republican thinkers in their own engagement with the West had some really important lessons to offer about methodology, about how it is that we, Anglophone political theorists, I live in the UK, I'm American, how Americans, British, European political thinkers could actually learn from Chinese political thinkers as we in the West learn from China and lots of other places in the world. So I actually saw them, I took them seriously as methodologists, as interpretive methodologists who thought very seriously about how we could overcome the problems of learning from difference, of learning from cultural otherness. So that brings me to my most recent project, which is of course the topic of this lecture. I recently had the honor to edit with Murad Idris and Megan Thomas the Oxford Handbook of Comparative Political Theory. And this really helped me confront how my own work fits into the larger domain of comparative political theory. So for this book, Megan, Murad, and I, between the three of us, read every single work that called itself comparative political theory. Now, these are overwhelmingly Anglophone essays and books, but which I'll get to in a moment, because comparative political theory, as it turns out, as we discovered, is itself part of a Eurocentric, itself reflects some of the Eurocentric anxieties about political theory. But in any case, we read every single work that could be considered comparative political theory. So this is probably hundreds of books and articles. And we tried to come up, in our introduction, we tried to come up with a definition of what it is. So this is what I have written here. This is from our introduction to this handbook. We say comparative political theory began emerging in the 1990s in response to the intensifying disconnect between a Eurocentric academic discipline and the recognition that political challenges, questions, and aspirations exceeded the West, in scare quotes. We're citing here germinal work by Roxane Euban, who I consider to be the founding mother of comparative political theory. And we go on to say, working at the intersections of political theory and area studies, international politics, and comparative politics, CPT, or comparative political theory, seeks to analyze normative claims, discursive structures and institutions, and expressions and formations of power in and from all parts of the world. So from this, you can kind of get a glimpse of what comparative political theory has become on the basis of what its practitioners are doing. It's a mode of intervening in contemporary knowledge production, particularly for political theory, and it's a way of drawing attention to the value of historically marginalized thought. So when I talk in this lecture about comparative political thought, I mean the inclusion of thought into mainstream political theory that has been historically or typically marginalized within that discipline. So it doesn't necessarily mean just geographically non-Western thought. It includes Indigenous First Nations thought, Mestizo-Mestiza thought, as well as various forms of subaltern thinking and politics. These kinds of politics, these kinds of thinking could be geographically situated within the United States, Canada, wherever. It doesn't necessarily exclude it. What we're interested in is how can we recognize that political theory has marginalized a huge range of thought from around the world, and then think about what it would mean to include it. So usually at this point in my lecture, if I'm actually talking to real students out there, I would ask them, why do you think we need comparative political thought? And some of the responses that I typically get are, well, politics is already global and globalized, right? We live in a globalized world. There's no escaping the fact that people from all over the world are joining together to take political action, to do things together. And we certainly should make political theory come to grips with what that entails. Um, we might argue that colonialism, the historical fact of colonialism and the rise of modernity, however you define that, have actually created convergence on a set of shared global problems. And there's a number of comparative political theorists, including Roxanne Ubben and Lubna El-Amin, who've argued something along these lines. We could also say that increasing contact across peoples and cultures makes it necessary for us to take seriously the possibility that political theory needs to learn from culturally different others. A sort of geopolitical economic reason for political theory might be the decreasing levels of Euro-American power and the increasing concentrations of money and power elsewhere, shifting the power centers of the world away from Europe and the United States towards Asia, the Middle East, Africa, etc. And if that's the case, then we need definitely to think about what kinds of ideas people in these parts of the world have about politics. I think that's just, for a purely practical reason, we need to do that. My favorite reason for why we need comparative political thought, when people ask me, why do you do comparative political thought? To me, the most obvious reason is non-white people can think, right? Like, you don't just have to be a European white male to produce really interesting, rich, compelling arguments about politics. It's true. Non-white people and women can actually think. And if that's the case, then we really have to do a lot of work in advancing comparative political theory. So if these are all true, and I think they are all true, all of these are good reasons for engaging in comparative political theory, we might, a better question might be, why not comparative political thought? So why comparative political theory? It seems that we have lots of good reasons for it. It's still not part of the mainstream discipline of political theory. And insofar as not everyone is doing political theory in a comparative way, or in a way that engages historically marginalized non-Western thought, well then why not? Why aren't we doing it? What might be some of the problems with what it is we're doing? And before I go there, I realized I forgot to address one small issue that sometimes comes up with the name of this trend, of this subfield, comparative political thought. Many people think that when we talk about comparative political thought, that we're actually talking about literal comparison. We're holding up two ideas or thinkers and then saying how they're the same and how they're different. It turns out that actually that's not exactly what comparative political thought is or does. Comparative political thought is more about the inclusion of marginalized voices, as I've said before, rather than exercises of direct comparison. There are people who do such exercises of direct comparison, but that's actually not the majority of the work people do. Most of the time, most people self-identifying as comparative political theorists are taking historically marginalized work and using it to shed light on shared dilemmas or problems. They're trying to think about the possibilities and limitations of existing political theory, or they're trying to show the value to some discussion or question about politics of these various bodies of thought that have been marginalized. So that's really what we mean. It's a very weak sense of comparison. But in what I'm about to discuss, we will have some, so this issue of comparison does come up again, but keep in mind that it doesn't necessarily mean literal comparison. Okay, so why not? Why wouldn't we have comparative political theory? Well, what is political theory anyway? I don't know if any of you have ever stopped to think about this. Political theory is a very broad church, but it has its limitations. Some have suggested that its knowledge just simply might be constituted by some specific way of thinking or a historical experience, like modernity, or if you follow Quentin Skinner, something like the rise of the state. And if you think that that's what political theory is, then it might make sense to just concentrate it on European thought and leave broader questions about politics to other fields. There's also the problem of cultural embeddedness. We're going to go through each one of these in the next few slides. This is sort of an introduction or an overview slide of the problems with comparative political theory, why we might run into issues if we try to do it or try to exercise it. The problem of cultural embeddedness is another issue. So if we recognize that everyone, that thought emerges not from some Archimedean vantage point outside time, but actually is embedded or situated within specific contexts of culture, history, discourse, gender, language, race, etc., then it actually becomes something of an issue if we hope to transplant knowledge produced in one place in time to another. So if we try to we move ideas across time or we move them across space, maybe it's simply more difficult to think about the way in which historically, a Chinese dynasty, a Chinese thinker from the Ming dynasty, separate from ourselves in time and space, maybe they have less to say to us here in a modernity, recreated by European colonialism and having all of these issues that are essentially concerned with the development of Euro-American power. Maybe it would be difficult to stage that conversation. The other problem is that there's a potential that comparative political theory might advance a form of intellectual imperialism, that we end up just forcing them, that is those historically marginalized others, to provide answers to our problems, right? In which case we're staging a very unfair conversation or intervention there. We're just using non-Western others for, extracting their insights to problems that we care about and not really caring enough about how they're thinking about politics. And then finally, it might be that the richness of any given thought community or body of thought, or I don't tend to like using the word tradition, but that might be something you could think about here, that the richness of any given thought community across time and space actually makes it quite difficult to include it into existing conversations. So it's not the case that you have like Chinese political thought in political theory, like you don't just squash them together. That would be a disaster, and it would completely undermine the richness and variegation of, of Chinese thought across time. I mean, that's a vast amount of stuff there, right? So maybe that's another problem that has to be overcome. So in what follows, I'm going to go over each of those four problems for expanding or advancing comparative political theory. I'm going to go over each of them. I'm going to give you some sense of the debate over these questions within literature on comparative political theory. And then finally, at the end, I'm going to tell you, of course, my own view.